There are many different ways that we can generate samples when we're finding statistics. So we're going to talk about some of those different ways. So an unbiased sample is one that a small replica of the entire population with regard to income, education, gender, race, religion, political affiliation, age, and so on. So what we have is a sample that's a good representative of our entire population with regards to a lot of different factors. The following sampling techniques will give you a brief idea of how statisticians obtain unbiased samples. Right? So a random sample is drawn in such a way that each time an item is selected, each item in the population has an equal chance of being drawn. When using a random sample, one combination of a specific number of items has the same probability of being selected as any other combination. The best procedure for selecting a random sample is to use a random number generator. So a lot of times this is done using some sort of technology to aid in this. As we're looking at these different types of samplings, this is going to be our best unbiased type of sample that we can get, is a truly random sample. A systematic sample is obtained by selecting a random starting point and then selecting every nth item in a population. It is important that the list from which the systematic sample chosen includes the entire population being studied. The problem that must be avoided when this method of sampling is choosing objects that have a constantly reoccurring characteristic that is not shared by all members of the population. So there could be slight problems with doing our systematic samples, but it is another way that we can generate samples. A cluster sample consists of a random selection of groups of units. A cluster sample is sometimes referred to as an area sample because it's frequently applied on a geographic basis. To select a cluster sample, we divide a geographic or other area or group into sections, and then we randomly select the entire sections or clusters. Okay. A stratified sample is drawn from a population divided into parts called strata. Stratified sampling involves dividing the population by characteristics called stratifying factors, such as gender, race, religion, or income, and then taking a random sample from each stratum. So we're separating it into groups, and unlike the cluster samples where we are selecting entire groups, when we are doing our stratified samples, we're selecting a few people from each group. The use of a stratified sample does require some sort of knowledge of the population. All right, and then the last type of sample that's listed is a convenience sample. A convenience sample uses data that are easily or readily obtained. Sometimes data are conveniently obtained, maybe the only data available, so some information may be better than none at all, but convenience sampling may be biased. So although they are easy to select, the data may be easy to obtain, caution must be used when using results from this method. So if our truly random sample was our best way of sampling, in this list, the other ones aren't necessarily in any particular order, but our convenience sample is going to be the worst possible way of selecting our sample because it could lead to some sort of bias. So in the next example, we're going to go through some different scenarios and classify these based on these sampling techniques that we just defined. All right, identify the sampling technique used to obtain a sample in the following. Explain. Every 20th can of soup coming off an assembly line is checked for defects. This is going to be an example of a systematic sampling. In a systematic sampling, every nth item is checked. In this case, we are checking every 20th item. A $50 gift certificate is given away at the annual Bankers Convention. Tickets are placed in a bin and the tickets are mixed up. Then the winning ticket is selected by a blindfolded person. This is a good example of a random sample. Each has an equal chance of being selected. So as previously mentioned, sometimes when we're selecting random samples, we may rely on technology. But in a case like this, if we have a smaller population that we're drawing from, we can select a random sample in such a way. Children in a large city are classified based on the neighborhood school they attend. A random sample of 5 schools is selected. All the children from each selected school are included in the sample. This is going to be an example of a cluster sampling. Groups which are chosen by geographic area, by school, are selected. So when we're selecting entire groups, especially if it is based on geographic locations, then when we're selecting entire groups, we are using a cluster sample. Right, the first 50 people entering a zoo are asked if they support an increase of taxes to support a zoo expansion. This would be an example of a convenience sample. It is easily obtained. Right? And it could very well be biased because if we're asking about the zoo to people that are walking into the zoo, they may have a different opinion than other people may. Right, all registered vehicles in the state of California are classified according to a type: subcompact, compact, midsize, full-size, SUV, and truck. A random sample of vehicles from each category is selected. So this is an example of a stratified sample. So there are strata or groups based on classification. And representatives from each strata are sampled. Right, so when you start working through the homework for section 12.1, there's some different questions asking you to identify different sampling techniques, whether it's by a description of the process used or a kind of scenario like this where we're trying to decide what was the sampling technique that was used in each of these different scenarios.